When I agreed to do the Earth Service, I knew I wanted to focus on good stuff happening on the 360 side. By 360, I mean the parts per million of CO2 of the atmosphere before the Industrial Revolution. Our atmosphere is now 412 parts per million. Will it get higher? Probably, given what is going on in Europe and Asia. Is it hopeless? Absolutely not. From Climate Forward, the New York Times, we have the tools to slow warming. Like the author of this article, Somini Sepulka, I cringe at questions about climate. I also cringe at the hype that the planet is about to become unlivable. So the urgent question for me is, what can be done to slow down carbon emissions? Tell me what's possible and tell me what stands in the way. The new report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, also known as the IPCC, tells us that the world already has many of the tools required to shift away from fossil fuels and slow down climate change quickly. It's doable, in other words, and it's just not getting done, at least not as quickly as it needs to be. But here are key points from the report. The technology is mostly here. We know how to shift away from fossil fuels for electricity and transportation. Renewable energy is growing and getting cheaper. Clean energy sources, mostly nuclear and hydro, but also wind and solar power, produce 38% of electricity the world used in 2021. We actually have a better shot now than we did a few years ago at slowing down climate change. When the Paris Agreement came together in 2015, the average global temperature was on track to warm by 4 degrees Celsius, or 7.2 degrees Fahrenheit, by the end of this century. If all countries meet their current emissions reductions pledges, that's a big if, the world will be on track to warm by around 2.7 degrees Celsius. Is that enough to avert really scary consequences? Maybe, but it is a movement forward. Shifting the global economy from carbon to renewables won't happen spontaneously. This would require the same kind of speaking and listening that was needed to end slavery, give women the right to vote, fund public schools, and give gay people the right to marry. I have said this a number of times to any number of people, but 250 years ago, many people in this country did not think it was possible to have an economy without slavery. The entire bottom floor of this African American Museum of the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. is devoted to that premise. We have lived with fossil fuels a long time, and mentally it is hard to give them up unless we can see the effects of fossil fuels, what they're costing us personally. And so what are those costs? Dr. Katherine Hayhoe is the director of the Climate Science Center at Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas. She is also the daughter of Christian missionaries, an evangelical Christian, and a champion of the earth. Her book, Saving Us, a climate scientist case for hope and healing in a divided world, is a must-read if you want to master the kind of listening and speaking that might unite us to end fossil fuels. Dr. Hayhoe has spent hundreds of hours discovering how to get people to talk about the effects of weird weather in their lives, their concerns about drought or flooding in their communities, the lack of reliable water, the health effects of air pollution, the absence of snow for skiing, and the loss of wildlife for hunting and fishing. Beginning a conversation with something that unites us instead of divides us means we are starting at a place of mutual respect, agreement, and understanding. something that can be difficult when it comes to climate change. I have stopped using the words climate change. I now say climate disruption, because disruption draws attention to the weirdness we're all experiencing or witnessing, be it blizzards in April, tornadoes in December, or record heat in January. To care about climate change, you only need to be a person living on planet Earth who wants a better future. And if you care about a better future, the best thing you can do is talk about it. A little social science from the article, How Social Media Made Americans Stupid, by Jonathan Haidt from the May Atlantic. Social scientists have identified at least 3 forces that collectively bind together successful democracies: social capital, social networks with high levels of trust, strong institutions, and shared stories. The most reliable cure for confirmation bias is interaction with people who don't share your beliefs. They confront you with counter evidence and counter argument. John Stuart Mill said, "He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of it." And he urged us to seek out conflicting views from persons who actually believe it. People who think differently and are willing to speak up if they disagree with you make you smarter, almost as if they are extensions of your own brain. People who try to silence or intimidate their critics make themselves stupid, almost as if they are shooting darts into the wrong brain. When we look away from our dysfunctional federal government, disconnect from social media, and talk with our neighbors directly, things seem more hopeful. Most Americans are members of the exhausted majority, which is tired of fighting and willing to listen to the other side and compromise. So let's look at some recent examples related to this issue. Brazil's climate politics are shifting. Brazil is, by some measures, the world's 6th biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. More important, though, is why. The recent explosion in deforestation rates, which have angered the world, will be a legacy of Jair Bolsonaro, the current president. Luiz Lula da Silva, the former president, is running against Bolsonaro, and the 2 candidates' radically different views on the environment could be crucial in who wins this fall. According to a poll last September, 80% of voters believe protecting the Amazon rainforest should be a priority for presidential candidates. A majority also said a specific plan to defend the Amazon would increase their willingness to vote for a candidate, and Lula is running as that candidate. Another headline from the Atlantic, the biggest investment ever in sucking carbon out of the sky. The world's biggest tech companies are getting serious about carbon removal out of the atmosphere. An alliance of prominent Silicon Valley companies, including Google, Meta, Shopify, and the payment company Stripe, announced it is pushing $925 million in carbon removal over the next 8 years. However, to go from thousands of metric tons of CO2 removal to billions of tons will require the federal government to pay to remove most of that carbon, which can only happen with a carbon price. Now, I personally welcome every idea, technology, and potential solution, regardless of the source. I know that some of these ideas will be dangerous, some will be expensive, and some have yet to be developed. But what I also know is that carbon pricing is key to making many of these ideas a reality. And I'm kind of ad-libbing here. My son sent me a wonderful conversation between a futurist and another person from the Atlantic. And the futurist talked about how important the early subsidies of solar and wind were in having these technologies become cheap and widely available. And that investment up front is essential to getting people on board. to make something happen. So let's take the owner of the CPA, To get to an agreement about carbon pricing requires that I focus on the concerns of everyday people in my life who have been directly or indirectly affected by climate disruption. So let's take the owner of the CPA firm where I work. He's a Nigerian immigrant who came to the US with his wife, drove a cab for 10 years before he became a CPA and started his business. Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa, full of smart, industrious people who have almost no path forward unless they leave. This is because Nigeria is run by kleptocrats who rely on oil to maintain power and steal from their people. Nigeria is in a club of kleptocrats that includes Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, Iran, most of the Middle East, and Russia. These countries rely on our addiction to fossil fuels to maintain the kleptocrats' power and, in the case of Russia, the delusion it can take over its neighbors. How many of you know immigrants from these countries? Can you talk to them about what oil has done to their countries and their future? Fossil fuels are very polluting. We have closed down most of the incinerators, but coal-burning power plants, diesel trucks, and gas-powered cars contribute over 30% of the air pollution, which heavily affects poor communities. Research shows that premature deaths in America due to air pollution are nearly twice as high as previously understood. This is a Harvard study. In 2018, fossil fuel air pollution was responsible for more than 8 million deaths worldwide, so before the pandemic. Do you know someone with asthma, autoimmune disorder, or sensitive lungs? Air pollution from fossil fuels is very bad for these people, and this is something to talk about. My sister Julie is on the board of a nonprofit that is working in Malawi to improve Malawans' self-sufficiency and economic independence. This is a Christian NGO, and Julie is not a big believer in climate change. No one in my family is. But I set up a Google alert for Malawi and the Great Lakes in connection with climate disruption and got back news that Malawi is struggling with consecutive tropical storms that are limiting harvest expectations. Quote, multiple climatic shocks and unfavorable macroeconomic conditions will limit crop production and increase food prices. By September 2022, poor and very poor households are expected to deplete own stocks and increase their reliance on markets earlier than usual. I sent the article to Julie, and here's what her response is. This is very interesting. I know the people in Malawi can't do much about the weather, but I agree that we can help here in the U.S. with global warming. Thanks for sending this. Speaking of weather, send us some warmer stuff, will you please? It's been really cold. She's included. A connection I share with my family in Ohio is the Great Lakes. We may be on different sides of the aisle politically, but we are united in our desire to protect Lake Michigan and Lake Erie from pollution and development. Fossil fuels pollute our lake water along with factories, waste treatment facilities, and agricultural runoff. Clean energy and carbon pricing could reduce this pollution dramatically. Build Back Better was a big mistake for many reasons, not the least being there were too many issues costing too much money in one pot. The parts of the bill aimed at reducing carbon emissions got mixed up with child tax credits, immigration reform, infrastructure, small business assistance, and on and on. Successful legislation often starts with one objective at the grassroots level, championed by one person or a small group willing to go the long haul. About 15 years ago, Josh Bullock, the Vice President of Farm Animal Protection at the Humane Society, began a grassroots initiative to end gestation crates and battery cages used to raise egg-laying chickens. In 2008, he avoided mixing his message with the gay marriage advocates in California regarding Proposition 8, which many of you may remember, because he was sure there were voters on both sides of the aisle who supported animal rights. Here's what Josh said. I've always believed that whether someone is a Republican, Democrat, or Independent, if you want to help animals have a better life, you're on the team. Preventing cruelty to animals goes beyond a nonpartisan issue. It's a human issue. Why start having a litmus test on political beliefs when helping animals should welcome everyone? From 2008, when we waged our first ballot campaign for chickens in California through today, the egg industry has shifted from about 3% cage-free to now 34% cage-free, and according to the USDA, will be at more than 70% cage-free before the end of this decade. Another success story we all know about is the American with Disabilities Act. That legislation began as a grassroots effort by Congressman Tony Coelho, who spent 10 years getting his bill through Congress, where it ultimately received overwhelming bipartisan support and was signed into law by President George H.W. Bush in 1990. The people who took this effort on did not deviate from their mission. They did not cloud it with other social justice initiatives, and more important, they made making disabilities a personal issue. Disabilities are not Republican agenda. The ADA and the humane treatment of animals affect us all, just as climate disruption and the effects of global warming impact us all. The key is to talk about these impacts with everyone you know and make them personal. Now, I'm an active member of the Citizens Climate Lobby and am committed to reaching out to business and political leaders in Chicago about supporting carbon fee and dividend. The new legislation is House Bill 2307, Energy, Innovation, and Carbon Dividend. I know this legislation can get bipartisan support if we make it happen. There are already bipartisan supporters. There are other carbon bills introduced in the current and previous Congress, but this may change after the midterms, and we do have to pay attention. However, I know that CCL's bill won't go away because we are in this for the long haul, and we already have bipartisan support. Over 75% of CCL's volunteers are under age 65, and 53% are under age 40, and they include Republicans and Democrats. What Katherine Hayhoe taught me in her book, Saving Us, is that statistics, projections, and science do not move people to act. Personal stories do. It helps to know the science and the facts around climate disruption and weather events. But these facts are background. They are not a replacement for stories, for the listening and speaking you can do to make a difference. Look at your own life and identify the concern you have related to the environment. Is it a future for grandchildren? Energy independence for our country outside of fossil fuels? Job mobility for all the people working in the coal, oil, and gas industries? Protection of Lake Michigan? Declining bird and insect species? A lot of people are so addicted to the narrative of despair about how the other side always wins and things are only getting worse that we tend to blind ourselves to the positive trends or downplay more encouraging developments, or what's worse, in the case of the environmentalists, dismiss anything other than their agenda. So if you blind yourself to the good stuff, it will make it that much harder to build on it. So it's worth asking yourself, what kind of politics or society do you want to see in 10 years? Climate disruption and global warming are global problems that require a lot of countries to work together. This is a big challenge requiring a lot of conversation. I bring this up not because I'm brimming with optimism about how this conversation will go. No, I bring it up because it's worth thinking about plausible and desirable ways the future can unfold so as to make hopefulness practical. Freedom of speech, open debate, protest, and political advocacy have the potential to bring about politics to address the climate emergency. This is why it's always been liberal democracies like the UK, Germany, Switzerland, and the US, and not autocratic states like China or Russia that have been the leaders in international climate progress. For all their flaws, democracies are good at thinking of the future, while the leaders of autocracies only think about themselves. And that is one of our core UU principles. We support the democratic principle. Now, I brought flyers and handouts about CCF. Even if you have no interest in becoming a member, you can learn a lot from their website. The information you will get will be nonpartisan, factual, and easy to understand. They're doing a whole campaign reinventing, the flyers from World War II. And I brought some of these. And there's Stand with Ukraine, Get Loud for Clean Energy. And I just read something yesterday that I didn't use in here, that the war in Ukraine is actually mobilizing at a much faster rate the willingness to get away from fossil fuels, particularly from Russia. I also have handouts, little things you can take home. It's your climate, let's get started. And you can join live, you'll see live informational sessions, get information about what's effective, why carbon pricing is good for the economy, why it's good for people, and why it's bipartisan. So take one. You're easy. Put it in your pocket. So, Earth Day is every day. So let us be grateful for spring, for being part of a democracy, and having agency to make the world a better place. Amen.